What's the deepest betrayal you've ever faced? Was it from a friend? A lover? Or was it from the very people who were supposed to protect you? Before we begin this journey, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Let's see how far this story travels. Today, we're telling a story about a girl whose own family sold her like a cattle. But from the ashes of that betrayal, she would rise to become a warrior, a hero, and a legend. This is a story about survival, redemption, and the scars that never truly fade. This is Clara's story. The air in the barn was thick with the smell of hay, sweat, and betrayal. Outside, a storm raged, mirroring the tempest in 13-year-old Clara's heart. She stood on a makeshift wooden block, her threadbare dress clinging to her shivering frame, her eyes locked on her father, Thorn. He wouldn't meet her gaze. Instead, he stared intently at the coarse, brutal-looking men who had gathered, their faces illuminated by flickering lantern light. They weren't here for livestock, they were here for her. Her own father was auctioning her off, and the silence in the barn was broken only by the grunts of the bidders and the rattling of coins. Her brother, Silas, stood beside their father, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. Just yesterday, he had been the golden child, the one who promised a future. Now, he was an accomplice to this nightmare. Clara's spirit, however, was a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. She had her mother's will, a fire that burned behind her tear-filled eyes. She scanned the faces in the crowd, each one a monster in the dim light, their greedy eyes appraising her as if she were nothing more than a piece of property. The bidding started low, a pittance for a human life, but it climbed steadily, each new offering a hammer blow to her soul. The final bid came from a man with a jagged scar that split his left eyebrow. He was a recruiter for a clandestine military academy, a place that forged children into weapons for the state. Thorn's eyes, hollow and defeated, finally met Clara's. There was no remorse, only the cold, hard glint of desperation. He had sold his daughter to save his son, to secure a future built on her sacrifice. The man with the scar approached the block, his boots crunching on the straw-strewn floor. He didn't offer a hand, he simply unclipped a lead from his belt. As he fastened it around her wrist, the cold metal felt like a shackle, sealing her fate. Clara didn't scream or cry. She held her head high, her gaze fixed on her father and brother, a silent vow of retribution echoing in the storm that raged both outside and within her. This was not an end, it was a brutal, unforgiving beginning. Before the storm, there was a fragile peace. Their small, rural village was nestled in a valley, a patchwork of green fields and dense forests under a vast, often gray sky. Life was hard, etched into the lines on her mother Mary's face and the calluses on Thorn's hands. But there were moments of warmth. Clara remembered her mother's hands, smelling of rosemary and earth, carding through her hair as she sang a lullaby about a mountain that touched the sky. "Just like you, my little sparrow," Mary would whisper. "You have a spirit that can reach the clouds." Mary was the heart of their small family, a woman whose strength was a quiet, unyielding force against the poverty that gnawed at their edges. Clara loved exploring the woods, more comfortable in the silent company of ancient trees than in the village square. She learned the forest's secrets, which berries were safe, how to track a deer, and how to move without a sound. It was her mother who had taught her, seeing a reflection of her own untamed spirit in her daughter. Thorn, however, saw only a liability. A daughter could be married off, her dowry a temporary relief. A son, like Silas, could inherit the land, work the fields, and carry the family name. This belief was the chasm that ran through their home, a silent, ever-widening crack. Silas, 2 years older than Clara, was a mirror of their father's ambitions. He was praised for his strength, his every clumsy attempt at farming lauded as a sign of future prosperity. He lorded his status over Clara, his taunts sharp and cruel. "You're just a girl," he'd sneer, "good for mending and cooking. Father says you're another mouth to feed." Clara would simply retreat to the forest, her sanctuary, where her worth wasn't measured by her gender but by her skill and resilience. It was there, among the whispering leaves, that she honed the survival instincts that would one day become her salvation. Mary's health began to fail as a harsh winter tightened its grip on the valley. A cough settled deep in her chest, and her vibrant energy slowly seeped away. Thorn grew more desperate, his temper fraying with each passing day. He saw Clara not as a daughter to be cherished, but as a burden that drained their meager resources. The favoritism towards Silas became more pronounced, more venomous. Clara spent her days tending to her mother, her heart aching with a premonition of the coming storm, the melody of the lullaby a fading echo of a life that was about to be irrevocably shattered. The winter that took Mary was relentless, a shroud of white that suffocated the land and the hope within their small cottage. Mary's last days were a blur of whispered words and labored breaths. She made Clara promise to be strong, to never let anyone extinguish the fire within her. "You are more than they see," Mary rasped, her hand clutching Clara's. "You are the mountain." With her mother's passing, the last warmth in the cottage vanished, replaced by an icy silence that was more terrifying than the howling wind outside. Thorn's grief curdled into a bitter resentment, all of it directed at Clara. In her, he saw Mary's spirit, a defiant strength that he could neither understand nor control. He saw a reminder of his own failure to provide, to protect. Silas, emboldened by his father's open disdain for his sister, became a tyrant. He would steal her food, trip her as she carried water, and mock her grief with a cruelty that was chilling. Clara endured it all in silence, her mother's promise a mantra that she repeated in the darkest corners of the night. The breaking point came with the spring thaw. A notice arrived from the landowner: their debt was due, and if they couldn't pay, they would be evicted. The sum was staggering, an impossible mountain of coin. Thorne's desperation became a palpable entity in the cottage, a suffocating presence that drove him to darker and darker thoughts. Clara heard whispers in the village, rumors of men who paid handsomely for recruits, children who were taken and never seen again. A cold dread began to coil in her stomach. One evening, she found her father and brother huddled over the table, their faces grim in the candlelight. A pouch of coins sat between them, more money than she had ever seen. Silas looked up, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of guilt crossed his face before it was replaced by his usual sneer. Thorne, however, looked at her with the cold, calculating eyes of a stranger. It was then that she understood. The money was for Silas's future, for the farm, for a life that she would not be a part of. The price of their survival was her. The betrayal was no longer a fear, it was a certainty, a cold, sharp knife twisting in her gut. She was the lamb being led to the slaughter, and her own family held the rope. The journey to the academy was a brutal awakening. Clara was chained in the back of a wagon with other children, their faces a mixture of terror and confusion. The man with the scar, whose name she learned was Commander Valerius, ruled with an iron fist. Any sign of weakness was met with a swift, merciless punishment. The world she knew, the green valleys and whispering forests, was replaced by a bleak, unforgiving landscape of rock and mud. The lullaby of her mother was drowned out by the rattling of chains and the harsh commands of their captors. The academy itself was a fortress carved into the side of a mountain, a place designed to break spirits and forge them into something new, something useful. The children were stripped of their names and given numbers. Clara became recruit 734. Their days were a relentless cycle of grueling physical training, combat drills, and ideological indoctrination. They were taught that weakness was a disease, emotion a liability, and obedience the only path to survival. Many of the children didn't make it, their bodies broken by the training or their minds shattered by the cruelty. Clara survived. The forest had taught her to be observant, to be resilient. She learned to push her body beyond its limits, to endure pain without a sound, to bury her emotions so deep that even she could barely find them. She became a ghost, silent and efficient, her movements fluid and deadly. But in the quiet of the night, in the brief moments before exhaustion claimed her, she would remember her mother's face, the warmth of her hand, and the promise she had made. The memory was both a comfort and a torment, a reminder of the girl she had been and the weapon she was becoming. One of her instructors was a young captain named Jake who was just 5 years older than her. He was from a family of warriors and soldier, and had been trained to become one from the tender age of 4. Jake was different from the others. While the other instructors ruled through fear, Captain Jake commanded respect through his discipline and skill. He was the most formidable soldier in the academy, his movements a blur of controlled violence, yet there was a stillness in his eyes, a hint of a soul that had not been entirely extinguished by the horrors of their world. He saw something in Recruit 734, a spark of defiance that even the academy's brutal regime could not snuff out. He began to single her out, pushing her harder than the others, testing her limits, seeing in her the potential for greatness. He saw the mountain her mother had always known was there. The academy was a crucible, and Captain Jake was the blacksmith. He took the raw, unrefined ore of Clara's survival instincts and began to hammer it into a weapon. His training methods were relentless, bordering on cruel. He would push her until she collapsed, her muscles screaming in protest, her lungs burning for air. He taught her to shoot with pinpoint accuracy, to fight with a knife as if it were an extension of her own hand, and to read a battlefield as if it were a map of her own making. He was shaping her into a soldier, but he was also teaching her something more: control. Clara, now 17, resented him for it. She saw him as just another tormentor, another man who sought to break her. But unlike the others, Jake's cruelty had a purpose. He would push her to the brink of failure, then show her how to step back from the edge. Emotion is a current, he told her once, his voice low and steady as they stood on a rain-swept training ground. Let it flow through you, but do not let it sweep you away. Control it, and you control the fight. He was the first person since her mother to see her not as a commodity or a number, but as a person with immense potential. A rivalry grew between Clara and the other recruits, particularly a brutish boy named Cale who saw her as a threat. He would sabotage her equipment, spread vicious rumors, and challenge her at every opportunity. The instructors turned a blind eye, believing that such internal conflict would weed out the weak. One day, during a hand-to-hand combat exercise, Cale's taunts went too far. He sneered about her being sold like a cheap trinket. Something inside Clara snapped. The carefully constructed walls around her emotions crumbled, and a cold, focused rage took over. She moved with a ferocity that stunned everyone, including herself. She disarmed Cale, broke his nose, and had him pinned to the ground before he could even register what had happened. Silence fell over the training yard. The other recruits stared in awe and fear. Captain Jake pulled her off Cale, his grip firm on her arm. She expected a reprimand, a punishment that would break her for good. Instead, he led her away from the prying eyes, his expression unreadable. When they were alone, he simply said, "Now you understand. That fire inside you? It can forge you, or it can consume you. The choice is yours." It was a turning point. Clara began to see Jake not as a tormentor, but as a teacher, the only one who had ever shown her how to harness the storm within. As the years passed, the academy's brutal routine became Clara's new normal. She rose through the ranks, her skill and discipline earning her a grudging respect from her peers and instructors. The girl who was once Recruit 734 was now a young woman, a soldier whose reputation preceded her. The bond between her and Captain Jake deepened, evolving from one of instructor and student to that of comrades in arms. He was the only one who saw the cracks in her hardened exterior, the lingering vulnerability of the girl who had been sold in a barn. Their conversations became more frequent, often taking place in the quiet moments after a grueling day of training. He would share stories of his own past, of a family he had lost to the very conflicts they were being trained to fight. He spoke of a world beyond the academy walls, a world that was worth fighting for. For the first time since her mother's death, Clara allowed herself to feel a flicker of trust, a fragile connection to another human being. She began to see the man behind the uniform, a man who was as much a prisoner of this life as she was. Their first mission together was a reconnaissance operation deep in enemy territory. It was a test, a final exam to see if she was ready. The mission went awry when they were ambushed. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and miles from safety. In the chaos of the firefight, Jake was hit, a bullet tearing through his shoulder. Without hesitation, Clara took command. The skills that Jake had so relentlessly drilled into her took over. She laid down suppressing fire, dragged him to cover, and tended to his wound with a practiced efficiency. For 2 days, she kept them alive, evading enemy patrols, foraging for food, and carrying the weight of a wounded Jake. She was the mountain her mother had always believed her to be, unyielding and resilient. When they finally made it back to their own lines, they were met with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Clara had not only survived, she had excelled, proving that she was more than just a soldier, she was a leader. As Jake was being carried away by the medics, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a pride that transcended their ranks. "I knew you had it in you," he murmured, a rare smile gracing his lips. In that moment, Clara knew that she had found something she thought she had lost forever, a family, forged not by blood, but by fire and trust. Clara's success on her first mission made her a legend within the academy. At 23, she was promoted to the rank of lieutenant, a feat unheard of for someone so young. She was no longer a recruit, she was a commander, leading her own unit into the most dangerous corners of the country's endless wars. She and Jake were now equals, their partnership a seamless dance of strategy and execution on the battlefield. The respect they shared had blossomed into something deeper, an unspoken affection that was as dangerous as any enemy they faced. In their world, emotional attachments were a weakness, a liability that could get them both killed. Their missions grew more perilous, taking them into the heart of the conflict. Clara witnessed horrors that would have broken a lesser person, villages burned to the ground, families torn apart, the innocent caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't understand. Each new atrocity was a fresh wound, a painful reminder of her own past, of the cruelty that humans were capable of. She fought with a cold, detached fury, her personal demons fueling her effectiveness as a soldier. She was saving others from the fate that had befallen her, a silent penance for a crime she did not commit. One day, during a briefing for a high-stakes mission, a familiar name appeared on the intelligence report, the name of the region where her home village was located. The mission was to liberate a series of towns that had been taken by a ruthless warlord, a man who was known for exploiting the local populace, forcing them into servitude. A cold knot of dread and anticipation tightened in Clara's stomach. The past she had tried so hard to bury was now her objective. Jake noticed the change in her immediately. Her usual stoicism was gone, replaced by a tense, haunted look. "What is it, Clara?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. She had never told him the full story of her past, the shame of it too great to bear. But looking into his eyes, she saw not judgment, but a steady, unwavering support. She told him everything, about her mother, her father, her brother, the barn, the auction. The confession was a torrent, a release of years of pent-up pain and anger. When she was finished, he didn't offer platitudes or pity. He simply took her hand, his touch a silent promise that she would not have to face this alone. The journey back to her home region was a surreal experience. The familiar landscapes, the rolling hills and dense forests of her childhood, were now scarred by the ravages of war. The air, which once smelled of pine and damp earth, was now tinged with the acrid smell of smoke and death. Clara felt like a ghost, an observer of a life that was no longer hers. The memories of her past, both good and bad, rose unbidden, each one a sharp pang in her chest. She saw herself as a young girl, running through these very woods, her mother's laughter echoing in the trees. The pain of that loss was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. Their unit set up a temporary base in a village a few miles from her own. The people they encountered were broken, their spirits crushed by the warlord's oppressive rule. Clara saw her own history reflected in their eyes, the desperation, the fear, the will to survive against all odds. Her resolve hardened. This was more than a mission, it was a crusade. It was for her mother, for the girl she had been, and for the countless others who had suffered at the hands of cruel and desperate men. Disguised as a peasant, Clara infiltrated her own village to gather intelligence. The place was almost unrecognizable. The once bustling market was now a desolate square, the cottages were in disrepair, and a palpable fear hung in the air like a thick fog. She saw faces she recognized, now gaunt and hollow-eyed. She kept her face hidden, her heart pounding with a mixture of grief and fury. And then she saw him. Her brother, Silas, was working for the warlord, a collaborator who enforced his master's brutal will upon his own people. He was well-fed, well-clothed, a stark contrast to the starving villagers around him. The smug satisfaction she remembered from the day of the auction was still there, now amplified by his newfound power. Later, she found her father, Thorn. He was a broken man, a shadow of his former self. He was old, frail, and his eyes held the vacant stare of a man who had lost his soul. He didn't recognize the hardened soldier who stood before him as the daughter he had sold. He simply saw her as another villager, another subject of the warlord's tyranny. The rage Clara had expected to feel was replaced by a hollow emptiness. There was no satisfaction in seeing him like this, only a profound sense of loss for the family she never truly had. The boy he had sacrificed her for had become a monster, and he was left with nothing. The full weight of his betrayal had come crashing down upon him, leaving only ruins in its wake. The intelligence Clara gathered was crucial. The warlord was based in the old landowner's manor, a fortified position on a hill overlooking the village. Silas was his second in command, a position he had earned through his ruthlessness and his intimate knowledge of the local people. The attack was planned for dawn. It would be swift, brutal, and decisive. For Clara, it was a collision of her past and present, a final, bloody chapter to a story that had begun in a barn so many years ago. The battle was a whirlwind of chaos and violence. Clara and her unit moved with a deadly precision, their training taking over as they stormed the manor. She fought with a cold, detached fury, every shot, every movement fueled by a decade of repressed anger and pain. She was not just a soldier fighting a war, she was a daughter avenging a betrayal, a woman reclaiming her life from the men who had stolen it. She moved through the manor like an avenging angel, her presence a harbinger of doom for the warlord and his men. She found Silas in the main hall, trying to rally the last of his men. When he saw her, his face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and fear. "Clara," he stammered, his bravado crumbling. The sister he had sold was back, no longer a helpless girl, but a hardened warrior. He tried to reason with her, to appeal to a sense of family that he himself had desecrated. "I did what I had to do," he pleaded, "for us, for our future." His words were hollow, a pathetic attempt to justify his own cowardice and greed. "You did it for yourself," Clara replied, her voice as cold and sharp as the blade in her hand. "You sold me for a future that you built on the suffering of others." The final confrontation was not a prolonged fight. Silas, for all his bluster, was no match for the soldier his sister had become. In the end, he was left disarmed and cowering on the floor, the same way she had been left in the barn. But Clara did not kill him. That would have been too easy, too clean an ending. Instead, she left him for the villagers to judge, his fate now in the hands of the people he had betrayed. Her justice was not about revenge, it was about accountability. As the dawn broke over the liberated village, Clara stood on the hill, looking down at the place that had once been her home. The battle was won, but the war within her was far from over. Jake found her there, his presence a quiet comfort in the aftermath of the storm. He didn't say anything, simply stood beside her, a silent witness to her pain and her triumph. The breaking point had been reached, and in its wake, there was a fragile, uncertain peace. In the aftermath of the battle, the village began to heal. The warlord was dead, and Silas was imprisoned, his fate decided by a council of elders who had suffered under his rule. He was sentenced to a life of hard labor, rebuilding the community he had helped to destroy. Clara found her father, Thorn, amidst the celebrating villagers. He finally recognized her, the daughter he had cast away, now hailed as their savior. He fell to his knees, his voice choked with sobs, begging for a forgiveness that Clara could not give. "I cannot erase what you did," she told him, her voice devoid of hatred, only a profound sadness. "But I will not let it define me. That is my justice." She turned and walked away, leaving him to the judgment of his own conscience, a punishment far greater than any she could inflict. Weeks later, back at the military central command, Clara was summoned before the High Council. She stood tall and proud in her dress uniform as the highest honor of her country, the Medal of Valor, was pinned to her chest. She had become a national hero, a symbol of resilience and courage. But as the generals lauded her bravery, her mind was elsewhere. It was in a small cottage, with a mother who sang lullabies about a mountain. It was in a dark forest, where a young girl learned to survive. It was in a muddy training yard, where a captain saw a fire that could not be extinguished. After the ceremony, Jake was waiting for her. He didn't speak of the medal or the mission. Instead, he led her to a quiet garden on the command grounds. There, under the shade of an old oak tree, he took her hand. "Clara," he began, his voice filled with a raw, unvarnished emotion she had never heard from him before. "For years, we have lived a life of duty and survival. I want more than that. I want a life with you." He knelt on one knee, producing a simple, unadorned ring. It wasn't a grand gesture, but a quiet, heartfelt promise of a future, a home, a peace they had both fought so hard for. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, the first she had shed not of sorrow, but of joy. She had been sold, betrayed, and broken. She had been forged into a weapon and had faced the ghosts of her past. But through it all, she had survived. She had found redemption, not in revenge, but in becoming a protector of the innocent. And now, she had found love, a love that had been her anchor in the storm. Her story had come full circle. The girl who had been sold to the highest bidder had won the highest honor, not just of her country, but the honor of a life reclaimed, a future she could now call her own. It was a bittersweet victory, a testament to the unyielding strength of a human spirit that had refused to be broken. It was the lullaby of the mountain, finally realized.